Good evening. If you put that sign up, David, you put 1 Peter 3:21 on there for me. That's a good lesson. I see them signs. They make you think, don't they? I'll never forget one time, Gary might remember, but we were headed through Colorado, coming back from skiing and down I-70, and we was in a church bus, and somebody come up beside us and held up a sign and said, "We're from the Church of Christ too," or something, and we got like holding up signs with like scriptures back and forth, and we was like running pretty hard, so finally Gary says, what's that scriptures? Jehu drove his chariot furiously. That's what we need to put up there. So that was pretty funny. I'll never forget that. Oh, okay. We're been going through these and kind of getting down to the end of what Timothy had to say about managing a household. Keeping children under control with all dignity. That's always one of those that gets discussed a lot. At what point are you not responsible for your children? At what point are you responsible for your children? I think once your kids are out of your household, I don't know that really applies to you. I think it applies to you when your kids are there. I think if you have kids of the age that should be believers and are not, that could be a problem. And I think, maybe that would be something that would need to be looked at. But, I think it doesn't really say they have to be saved here necessarily, but it does say that they have to be under control and with dignity. You know what that means? It means they're not under control because you're beating them to death, right? They're under control because, in a dignified way. In other words, they have respect for their father, is what it's really saying. The children have respect for their father. Doesn't mean the children aren't ever going to mess up, because children are going to mess up. But it means that overall, that's not their nature. Their nature is they're obedient children, obedient to their parents, to their father. And so, but a lot of times we say children, the plurality of children, we've had that discussion a lot of times. Is one child, does that qualify someone? And I say absolutely. If you have one child and somebody says, "Do you have children?" the answer is yes. I mean, I don't think I've heard that discussion, well, you can't be an elder because you only have one child. We've had the discussion about biological children opposed to adopted children. That discussion's been had several times. And I don't really see that as being an issue in my mind. If you have adopted children and they're under control, then to me, they're your children. I mean, they're, no different than if you're biological children, they're your children. Because you're not looking to say they're able to procreate here. You're looking to say they're able to manage their household, manage their kids. That's what you're looking for here. So, I think that's a lot of those discussions we have are kind of needless. He clarifies that, right? If a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? Now, only in Timothy does it say not a new convert. It doesn't say that. When we look at Titus, it's not going to be there because that wouldn't have applied. Titus was in Crete. Paul had just left Crete. He left Titus there to set in order the things he didn't do. The church in Crete was new. There was no way he could have told Titus not a new convert because that wouldn't have been anybody. So, it kind of gives you a little idea that these qualifications they're not necessarily set in stone. In different situations, you're still looking for that kind of man, but maybe you can't find that man that, I think that's why Paul did that. But in this case, it's better to have someone that's mature, that's been in the church, that's doctrinally sound. That's what you want. Someone who's able to teach, someone who knows Scripture. That's what you want, ideally. Does that mean that you can't get somebody to be an elder that's a work in progress? Well, I think in Titus's case, that's absolutely what Paul was saying. You're going to have to they might be a little bit of a work in progress, but you got to have an elder. So you need, it doesn't. But I think in this case, you're looking at Ephesus, and Ephesus is an old church, respectively speaking. So it's easy for him to tell Timothy not a new convert because Timothy has that pool to choose from, whereas Titus didn't have it. So, once again, difference in the list, a little difference in that list. Must have a good reputation of those outside the church. Does that mean that everybody outside the church loves him? I don't think so. I don't think that's what that means at all. I think it means that overall your reputation should be good. Is there not going to be somebody that has something bad to say about you? Well, probably, you know. That's what I'm saying. If you really hold the line too tight on this, you're not going to have anybody, because nobody's going to hold that perfect line, because we're just not that perfect. And God understands that. Paul understands that. So, you know, we kind of have to think, what does it mean? What is the nature of the person? Not to fall into reproach. So that's what an elder should look like. What if an elder gets where he doesn't look like this anymore? What happens then? Should? What if he doesn't step down? Yeah, at that point, your other elders have to make that decision that you can't be an elder anymore. So it's possible to fall out of this list. Am I right? It's possible to fall out of this list. Just as easy as it is to get into it, you can fall out of it, right? So, you know, and sometimes that happens in elderships for whatever reason. Could be a public sin, or could be, you know, something in their life, or something that shows up, or, you know, you never know. And if it does, if it's going to bring reproach on the church, then they need to step down, or they need to be asked to step down. And that's always a really hard thing, I think, to do in a congregation, is to ask someone to step down. Are there any comments about Timothy? Well, I said I don't think it necessarily states that. I think it's better if they are, especially if they're age they can be saved. I think they should be. Yeah, Titus is a little different, honestly. And that's kind of weird, isn't it, in Titus, to say that he brings that up in Titus. He doesn't bring it up in Timothy. So maybe in the church in Ephesus, since he's talking about older men who are been in the church longer, maybe it's understood that the children are already saved. In this case, where he says these men could be new converts, that could be a real issue. If you're a new convert to the church, a newer convert to the church, your children might not be saved yet. So this could be another issue at all involved here, do you think? A little bit different situation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there, like Gary says, there's overlap here, you know, instructions. And these letters were circulated too, so they knew that. It says husband of one wife, about the same thing. But here, like Gary says, a different in the list. Having children who believe, and also, if you look at here, it says not accused of dissipation or rebellion. That's pretty big. That's a pretty big word, right? Not to be accused of rebellion. It's a different place. Crete's a different place than Ephesus. Yeah. It basically means dissent, or basically means that you're stirring problems, you know. So he's, you know, and I think that's a not satisfied, stirring trouble, you know, that type of thing. So I think it's interesting, you know, there is differences in, like Gary says, there's overlap in these. Some things are the same, but on the other hand, other things are different. Different word in the Greek in 7 than what we get in Timothy, overseer. Different word. Must be above reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, quick-tempered. Addicted to wine, pugnacious, we talked about that. That means a fighter. Are fond of sordid gain. Hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so he'll be able both to exhort in sound doctrine, to refute those who contradict. It's a little bit different list, a little shorter list. But then again, there's a few things here that aren't in Timothy, like believing children, and there's some things here that aren't in Timothy. There's some things in Timothy that aren't here, like not a new convert. Yeah. I think, like Gary says, I think you kind of got to count them both. And I think in different I think in different situations, you're going to look like if you was to plant a new church, like a church plant, you might have to think not a new convert even today. Or if you was to go down to South America or go somewhere like they do in a mission deal and start a church, you might have to think, well, I don't have anybody here that's not a new convert. Maybe I need to think of that. But when you get in a church that's established, I think that it is different because I think in that case you should have a pool of men that are more mature. So I think, like Brent really says, it really talks about the type of man you want to do. You want the best person. You want the best people, like in anything. You want the best people to do it. So if you've got people that are mature, that have been in the church a long time, that's who you probably really want to get. Yeah. Well, I think, Gary brought that up last Sunday, children who believe. And I think I think individually as congregations, sometimes you got to look at that and other elders. I don't know at what age you think your children should be saved or what age, or where that comes into play. But I think that can be a factor for sure, especially if they're not controlled and disciplined and coming to church and doing those things. Yeah, I think that would be something you'd have to look at. Yeah. Not much. Pretty much, absolutely. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, Sam. Yeah. That's right. That's exactly where you start getting that literal interpretation, and you start to, you know. I think if you had children that even were out of your house, if they were really that bad of kids, it would hurt your reputation outside. I think that would affect on other levels. I think that would affect your ability to be an elder. Yeah, I understand. Trust me, I understand 100%. This is one of those things that it's divided a lot of congregations, and it's yeah, Gary. Right. Yeah, I think there's just a lot of things to, congregations have to, I think the main thing to me is congregations have to be comfortable with who their elders are. I think if they're not, for whatever reason on that list or whatever, then that can be an issue. The elders need to have the respect of the congregation. Number one, I think that's the most important thing for an elder. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we were at a church, small church, that there were men who were qualified to do it, but they're like, well, we're so small, we don't need elders. But that's just not true, you know. So, I mean, you know, so there's a lot of things. But I think congregations, elderships, have to come to terms in their own congregation a lot of times with what they think. They can respect a man. A man has to be respected by the church, by the congregation. That's the most important thing. I think churches need elders. I believe God calls churches to have elders. And, you know, I think that my own opinion is we've ran a lot of men off over the years because of this, a lot of the things on these lists that literally we shouldn't have run them off for. That's just my own humble opinion. I mean, I do think men need to meet these requirements, this list, but it's like Gary said, it's like everybody here knows. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's going to be, you know, and we have to take that into consideration, I think, when we look at men to be elders. So why do we have elders? Well, that's what God told us to do. That's the number one thing I can tell you. It's the only example we have of leadership in the church. The only biblical example we have of leadership in a church is a ministering evangelist until elders are installed. That's the only example we have. We have no other example. So if we're going to be first century, if we're going to do what the Bible says, then we need to look at what elders do. It's always plural. Elders are never singular. Always plural. Some churches have two. It's better to have more. Never more than one congregation. Elders never served over multiple locations in the New Testament. Elders always had one location, one congregation. So does that mean we couldn't go down and help a church in Waleeka or help the church in Otwogie? Doesn't mean that at all. It just means that our elders could tell us here what to do about that, but they still wouldn't be elders over that other congregation, even if we were involved, because that's not our biblical example. We would need to have elders in those other congregations. That would be our mission, would be to get men that could be elders in them other congregations. We don't have any biblical example of any other type of rule. I didn't grow up with elders, didn't know there was such a thing, didn't know there's elder-led churches. I grew up with pastor-led churches. I grew up in Catholicism where you had a pope, which is a whole different situation. So, you know, but there's no other biblical example. And it's really important to me. It's one reason that really made me want to be part of the church was the leadership of the church. I just think I've seen so much. And as me as a preacher, It is so refreshing, so wonderful for me not to have to be. When I was in the pastor-led churches over the years, man, I seen the toll it took on them guys. I mean, it was crazy. You know, everybody was going to them. It was always their problem. It was always they had to deal with. They had to do it. They had to worry about this. They had to worry about that. Praise the Lord, I don't have to worry about that stuff. You know, I don't even know how much money's in the bank. I don't care. As long as there's enough for whatever, I'm fine. You know, if the elders say I need to preach about giving, I'll preach about giving, but I don't care. You know, when somebody comes to me and needs money or something, I don't have to deal with that. I mean, I don't mind doing that, and I'll help do that, but it's not just on me. And that's really, really, really nice, let me tell you. When somebody calls me at 11 or 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning, and they do that quite a bit, and say, would you help me with this? Would you do this? And I can say, you know, that's something you need to talk to our elders about. I don't have the authority to do that. That is wonderful to be able to say that. You know, not to be the guy that has to say, oh, well, I'm just not going to help you. You know, so for me, from my perspective as a preacher, it's wonderful to have elders. You know, I would never want to be in a congregation that didn't have elders. Yeah. 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 Well, elders are a tremendous, and a lot of churches have preachers and elders. We go to a lot of these things, and man, it seems like they talk about all the troubles they have, preachers and elder trouble. A lot of churches do have problems, clashes between preachers and elders, but realistically, as a preacher, as a minister, having elders is a blessing. And I just, you know, I hate the stuff that they have to put up with, and sometimes I try to deal with that, and I will deal with it. If they say, Rex, you need to do it or do it, I will do it. I mean, it's not a problem. I don't mind doing it, but just having that backing behind you as a preacher is amazing. You know, I just can't imagine preaching and not having that behind you. I think it's really, really a blessing for a preacher. Yeah. I think Mennonites maybe. Mennonites, Amish. Um, First Christian does, or Christian churches do. Yeah, it's not the normal for sure. Hmm. It's not the normal, for absolute positive. It's not the normal. Um, so it's necessary. Even young congregations had elders in Titus. Um, so I think it's a good thing. It's the only scriptural example of leadership, congregations that are self-governed by a plurality of elders. That's the only biblical example we have of churches. So what does an elder do? Well, an elder guards the flock, number one. Yeah. Right, like a synod, basically. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's they're to guard the flock. That's their number one job as overseers. They're to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. And that, so you get two different words in there in the Greek. Um, Paul says, know that after my departure, savage words will come in among you, not sparing the flock. For among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore be on the alert. Remember that night and day for a period of 3 years I did not cease to admonish each one with tears. So, once again, plurality there, overseers to shepherd the church of God. So, that's their number one thing. They're spiritual leaders, not just managers, not just people who write the checks. There are spiritual leaders, and they are my spiritual leader too. So, even though I preach and I get the ability to do that, I still am under the authority of our elders. And spiritually, they're my overseer too. So if they say, Rex, you shouldn't say that, or it's not how we want to look at that, or maybe we need to preach about this, then absolutely, I do. So, because I'm also under their oversight. 1 Peter 5 says, I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness the sufferings of Christ, a partaker also of the glories to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, not for sort of gain, but with eagerness, not as lording over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples of the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive an unfading crown of glory. So Peter talks about the fact that he's an elder, and because of that, he says this is what you need to do. You need to shepherd the flock of God as a shepherd, poimen, exercising oversight, examples to the flock. So, primarily, that's their job. They're overseers. Acts 20, 28, 1 Thessalonians, Hebrews, 1 Peter, we just read some of those. They're overseers of God's people. They're supposed to be teachers, able to teach doctrine. And that's a doctrine we use in the church. That's under their direction. If we just do something different, that would be an elder's decision, not Rex's decision. So that's their job, and that's why they need to know. They need to know the scriptures. They need to be able to resolve differences, which is a big thing in the church. They need to be able to do that. They need to be able to resolve differences. They need to be able to commission leaders, as in deacons. They need to minister to the sick, James 5:14 through 15. Call the elders to pray and to anoint them with oil. So they have a lot of duties. None of them in this whole list says anything about writing checks, worrying about building insurance, or the tires on the bus. So, but they have a lot of duties that, unfortunately, in our world, these get overshadowed, I think, a lot of times by the business of the church, and not sometimes as much the spiritual leadership, which is what we should look to them for. So, yeah, Sam. I don't necessarily that it means all the time publicly teaching doctrine, but I think it means that they're able to teach doctrine, and that they do teach the doctrine that we observe. Even though I don't necessarily think that means they have to get up and do it. I mean, they can, but I don't always think that means elders have to be able. I think they need to be able to teach, but not all people are teachers, natural teachers. Doesn't mean they can't teach or expound on something, but not all people are able to get up in front of a crowd and, I think that's a talent within itself, but they still need to be able to teach doctrine, even if they're teaching it to the person who is standing up speaking. So, I think a lot of times in the church, our doctrine in a way is kind of set in stone over the years. So there's not a lot of debate about most of what goes on. But then again, in a lot of churches now, there is a lot of debate, right? Instrumental music, women's role in worship. There's a lot of debate going on in a lot of churches, and elders are right in the middle of those. They're right in the middle of those debates all the time. So, doctrine is important. So, and unfortunately, elders get under the fray of that, probably more than ministers do. Yeah. Right. You can. Yeah. Well, I think other elders have to decide that a lot too. And that's a problem in churches because let's face it, a lot of preachers have got masters in divinity. I mean, they're going to be way more educated biblically than the elders. I mean, just because a lot of times they've been to college for that. A lot of times elders haven't been to college for that. So, I think, that can be a difficulty between preachers and elders sometimes. So, that's something I think we see maybe now more than we did 50 or 60 years ago or 100 years ago. But yeah, that's a big deal, and I think, and we hear that sometimes when we go to these preachers and conferences and stuff and elders things. I've heard that, before. Well, the preacher's the more knowledgeable. The preacher's the one that ought to be saying because he's the more knowledgeable one. And I don't agree with that philosophy. I mean, I think the preacher and the elders can discuss that, and the preacher definitely can have input and talk about that, but ultimately it's still going to come back to elders' decision, what's going to happen. So, I think that can be an issue in our day and age. The men who meet the requirements, basically. We spend a lot of time with that. So what is our responsibility? I think that's something we don't spend enough time talking about sometimes. What's our responsibility as members of the congregation? We're the sheep of the pasture, right? We're the sheep. And I've preached 2 or 3 sermons on that, being sheep, because I think it's important that we understand, what that means. And when you join or place membership in a congregation, you're putting yourself under that eldership, under that leadership, and you're submitting to that leadership. So I think that's important that we think a little bit about that. In Hebrews, it says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give account. Let them do with joy and not with griefs, for this would be unprofitable for you. So, we have a responsibility to make it joyful for them when we need elders. And let's face it, elders don't get paid to do that job. Some congregations pay elders, but we don't. Elders don't get paid for that. They don't get any benefit for that. They don't get anything for that except the fact that they're serving God and serving us. And, there's nothing holding them to that position. So, except their desire to serve God. So we as Christians, we as members of the congregation or sheep, we need to consider that, right? When we did the food bank all those times and when you're a management person, like I've always had employees, and other people there had employees, and we would try to, but you got to remember when you're in the food bank, those people are volunteers. They're not employees, You have to work different with that than you do if you're paying them, sometimes. So, so you can't just say, go get that and take care of that. You got to say, like, would you mind going and getting that over there? So it's a little bit different, So we have to consider that with our elders. Paul says, we request of you that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another. So Paul says we should esteem them highly because of their work. So, I think we as members, us as sheep, we need to consider those things when we talk about our eldership. I think elders are important for us and important for the church. And I know I've been in churches that didn't have elders. I've been in Church of Christ that didn't have elders for whatever reason. Too small, nobody qualified. I kind of made a decision several years ago for me and my family that we were going to worship in a church that had elders. That was just kind of a decision that I kind of came to, many, many years ago, actually, because I felt like that my own little opinion, I guess, if it matters, but men's business meetings and men doing the job of an elder that aren't elders always kind of bothered me. We would have business meetings and men would be like, well, we need to do that, we need to do this. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, these men are qualified to be elders. If they're that concerned about the way we're doing things, then they need to step up and take the office, or they need to let the guys we have do the job that they've decided that they're willing to do, So, I think that was always important to me. I was glad we quit having men's business meetings. I grew up all my life with business meetings in church, business meetings in church. And they're very divisive, in my opinion. And I think if you have elders that are doing their job, that you can trust, I think things just work a lot smoother. That's the way I think. If you have elders that aren't doing their job, if you have a preacher that's trying to control things, and that's hard for me, I think, because I am a controlling person, and I'm a person that's been in charge most of my life. I'm not a person that's really ever worked for people very much. I just never have been that guy. I've always been the guy that did it my way, fixed the problem, solved the difficulty, and that's been a problem for me as a minister, because sometimes I try to do too much. I overstep. I understand that. I've tried to be a lot better about that, telling Brent and Gary and Jeff if he's out there. I've tried to be a lot better about that because, that's my nature. My nature is to fix it. Whatever it is, fix it now, whatever it takes. That's Rex's nature. And I've had to teach myself, and still working on it, I'm still a work in progress, but I've had to teach myself to step back and say, these men need to know, we need to make a decision together, or they need to make a decision, and I don't need to make it. So it's, it's a work in progress for me, for sure. I'm better now than I used to be, but definitely been a work in progress for me to be better about that. But the nice thing is all our elders here were all my good friends before I was ever a minister. So that's good. We know each other. And I understand, and we go to these things, difficulties that they have with preachers and difficulties we've had over the years with preachers and that conflict between preachers and elders. And I think it's important as a congregation, I think it's important that, and the elders have said this to me several times, and I agree, we need to be on the same page, them, me, we need to be on the same page. When you look at us, you need to get the same, and I haven't always been good at that. A few times I've kind of stepped out of line, but we need to be united in what we do, because that's what the church needs. It needs solid leadership that they can depend on, that they can trust, that are going to help you, that are going to come to you if you need them to come to you. And I just think that type of relationship is to be valued. We should be thankful that we are able to have that relationship here that I think we have between ministers and elders and the members of our congregation.
Do you think it's safe to say that the Church of Christ is not the only church with elders and deacons?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's absolutely other churches with elders and deacons. And as a Baptist, I grew up, we had deacons. We had deacons that did things, but we didn't have elders. We was a pastor-led church, so we had a pastor who, basically made all the decisions, and then there were deacons underneath him that more or less did, what our deacons do, whether that was education or building or.
Every Baptist church is just one Baptist.
I don't have a clue. I was raised in two different Baptist churches in my life. One of them was like a Northern Baptist deal when I was in Colorado, and I was too young to honestly tell you anything, except it was a really pretty building and had really high ceilings. And my Grammy's shoulder was super comfortable. And but here I was in Southern Baptist, so it was a convention, you know. So basically our preachers were more or less vetted by that convention, and I guess ultimately, I guess financially, somewhat they answered to that convention. Really can't answer that question. I don't know. We had deacons underneath that. We had business meetings once a month. One Sunday night a month, we had a big business meeting. Things were decided. People voted. That was my upbringing. And of course, in the Catholic Church, there was none of that because that was all decided in Rome. So there was that wasn't an issue. Things were pretty set in stone. So, any other comments? I mean, it's one of those things, once again, as we hold it up to doctrine, it's one of those things. You can't say, it doesn't say you can't have another way. There's nothing condemning it. There's nothing in the Bible that says you can't have a pastor-led church. There's no commandment that says that. But if we try to do, which that's all this has been about, trying to do what the Bible says, try to look like the first century church. If we're going to do that, the first century church had elders. So, you know, I'm not condemning anybody. I'm not condemning other people that do things different ways. It's no way am I being condemning. I'm just saying that if we're going to follow the example of doctrine we've looked at, as we've looked at music, we've looked at giving, we've looked at prayer, we've looked at all these different things, communion, all these other things we looked at, if we're going to hold ourselves to that same standard, then we should have elders. Because that is our first century apostolic example of how churches were led. So, you know, I think you got to leave it at that. Same thing we could say about the Lord's Supper. Does it say you have to take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week? No, there's no commandment in the Bible that says thou shalt take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. But in our holding of doctrine, the example is the churches came together on the first day of the week to break bread, to take communion. We're trying to follow that example, so that's what we do. They didn't use instruments. We're trying to follow that example, so that's what we do. They gave as they were prospered. They didn't tithe. We're trying to follow that example, so that's what we do. They were elder-led churches. We're trying to follow that example, so that's what we do. That's the best way I know to put it. Just not condemning other people. I know the arguments for other ways, but if we're going to hold ourselves to that standard of trying to look like the first century church and look at apostolic example of the Bible of how we're supposed to be, that is our example. So on every other level, we should look at that, and on this level, we should look at that. And if we're going to try to replicate it, then that's the way we have to do it. That's the replication of it. Do I like elders and elder-led churches? I'm all about it, as you can probably tell. I'm all about it, right? Am I going to tell you that if church doesn't have elders, they're wrong? Or no, I'm not going to say that, because I don't know. I'm not going to give you that. I don't know it. They can be whatever. I grew up in a lot of different things. Like I said, I've been in churches of Christ that didn't even have elders. So I can't say if a church doesn't have elders, I'm going to condemn them. I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to say that's our example, and that's what we follow, and that's why we do it. And there's a reason we do it, and this is the reason. So, you know, I think that's kind of where I'd leave that. As we end this, and probably going to start Hebrews next Wednesday night. So anyway, thanks for your time.